Hello and welcome to this evening's Sheffield Salon. My name is Frankie Anderson. I'm pleased to see so many of you here. This evening's Sheffield Salon is in conjunction with the University of Sheffield School of Education as part of the Economics and Social Research Council's Festival of Social Science. I will be chairing this evening's debate, Nanny, Nudger or Therapist, it's a state enhancing or undermining our personal decision making. Tonight's debate focuses on the British government's world-leading role in using insights from academic research in behavioural economics, neuroscience and psychology and public policy and services in order to change people's choices and behaviours. You may have heard of nudge, which is the most well-known concept in this area, introduced by Thaler and Sunstein in their seminal book, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness. It now holds centre stage at the Cabinet's Office Behavioural Insight Team. From ideas around nudge, government has introduced policies as far and diverse as the Inland Revenues sending letters to those who have yet to pay their taxes, underline the proportion of their neighbours who have already paid, removing alcohol from prominent positions such as the end of aisles, or asking people applying for driving licences if they would also like to sign up for the organ donation register at the same time. All of this is an attempt to encourage or nudge people into making the right health or social decisions that they should benefit from them and society in the long run. But nudge is just one part of this government's behaviour change story. More widely, the previous government has pioneered more subtle therapeutic types of intervention to develop children's emotional well-being, to try to solve disruptive behaviours in schools, and to be involved in child-mother bonding and attachment. Here, psychology combines with neuroscience and counselling in new ways. But given that we are seeing an increasing healthcare cost in response to smoking, mental ill health, alcohol and obesity, at a time with fewer and finite economic research resources, nudge is used as the language of choice architecture to encourage rather than force people to make the correct decisions. Therapeutic interventions uses a different language, but all are backed up or meant to be with scientific evidence. Some have argued that nudge reduces us to rats in a maze, that by undermining our concept of free choice and autonomy, we will undermine ourselves as free agents and develop a far more paternalistic relationship with the state. More of the paternalism and less of the liberalism.
I'm a geographer, as you stated, so it may be a good opportunity for me at the beginning to explain why, as a geographer, I'm interested in nudging and behaviour change. And basically, I'm interested in it because of the emphasis that's placed within behaviour change and nudging on changing the environments within which we make decisions. And in doing so, choice architects can also encourage us, obviously, to make the appropriate decisions, the decisions that are deemed to be in our own best interest. I was going to explain maybe what nudging is, but I think you've covered that, to be honest, Frankie. So I'll move on to 3 points that I want to make first, I suppose. One is in relation to why has nudging appeared now? Why has it emerged now over the past few years? How prevalent it is? And finally, why we might think of it as being something that is quite contentious and potentially quite problematic. To start off with this idea of why it's emerged now, and I think there are a number of reasons we can identify here. First of all, I think that there has been a growth of new academic understandings of what makes people tick, what actually influences the decisions that people make, how people come to make decisions. We've had insights here from behavioural science, from behavioural psychology, from behavioural economics, and things like neuroscience as well. We're all familiar with those brain scans and the way in which they are being used to try and understand why people make particular kinds of decisions and how they respond to different kinds of stimuli as well. So there's, if you like, the emergence of a new kind of science, a new kind of understanding of the human subject, that states that we aren't this rational being that has been the focus and the basis of a lot of economics and understandings of the human subject. We aren't rational, we are predictably irrational. to use the words of Ariely. This idea that we are, yes, we do contain elements of rationality, but lurking in each of us, there is a Homer Simpson striving to get out. Somebody who is very irrational, who thinks for the present, doesn't think rationally about the future implications of their current decisions. So there's been a growth in a new kind of science, if you like, a new understanding of the human subject. Following on from that, I suppose, there's a sense in which traditional kinds of policies and interventions haven't been all that successful or effective. Traditional kinds of policies, if you like, that have been based on taxing us into behaving in particular kinds of ways, traditional kinds of policies that have emphasized the need to provide a lot of information to us so we can actually make appropriate decisions. They haven't been particularly effective. We all eat too much, we all drink too much, we all engage in unsafe sex, but we do a lot of things that we shouldn't do, even though we know better. And so there's a sense there in which these traditional kinds of interventions don't work. So there's been an attempt to try and, if you like, use the insight that we are predictably irrational as a way of framing policy in a slightly different way. As one policymaker that we interviewed in the project we did before said, of working with the grain of human cognition. So there's an idea that these nudge policies are more effective than their predecessors. And I guess the third thing as well, that there is a sense in which these interventions are deemed to be cheaper. They're not based on these massive kinds of interventions where you try and roll out these new rules and regulations. They're on shaping and subtly changing the decision-making environments that we confront in our day-to-day lives. And in doing so, we can, in a quite a cost-effective manner, change the kinds of decisions that people make and change them for the better. So that, if you like, is why it's emerged. I'll move on to how prevalent behaviour change is. Frankie mentioned the Behavioural Insights Team. I think the one thing I'd want to stress there is that this isn't a creation of the coalition government. If you go back to 2004, important document published back then by the Labour government, by the Cabinet Office, that laid the groundwork in many ways for nudge policies, a document entitled Personal Responsibility. So it is a way of framing public policy that appeals to all kinds of political party at one level. It appeals to the coalition, but it also has appealed traditionally to the Labour Party. And so there's something quite interesting there about the way in which it can be borrowed and used by political parties, ostensibly coming from different directions. And I think that as well as being framed there in terms of an ideology of government, if you like, an ideological way of framing public policy, Frankie mentioned the different kinds of experiments that we've had. And it's interesting to note that it isn't just things going on at a UK level. Local authorities are experimenting with nudge policies. You can think about the Barnet City Council collecting rubbish on a certain weeks as a way of encouraging people to recycle more. You can think about the example that's been most prevalent in Wales as well, which has been the change in the default setting for organ donation. So the debate has been ongoing in Wales, and hopefully it has crossed the border into England as well, is about changing the default. So instead of people having to opt into organ donation, they have to opt out now. And that sort of recognises the fact that we're lazy, we don't want to fill in any forms, we also certainly don't want to think about a future, and definitely we don't want to think about a future in which we're dead. And so it recognises this idea that we need to sort of frame the decision-making process in a slightly different way in order to encourage better decisions.
1 minute left.
1 minute left. That's the one thing I'll flag up very quickly is that nudging isn't just a UK and a US phenomenon. In terms of the work we're doing in a current project, the current ESRC project, we've identified 41 countries, including places like Lesotho, Ghana, that have central government policy initiatives that are based on behaviour change. So it is something that is going global, if you like. Now, in terms of one thing I want to say right at the very end, we can get on to the contentious aspects of nudging, if you like, but one thing I want to stress maybe is the role of the social sciences in trying to deal critically with the idea of nudge. It was proposed to have a chief social scientific officer for the UK state, but that's suddenly become a chief behavioural scientist. And I think there's something missing there almost in terms of the role of the social sciences in providing a critique of nudging and saying, well, people don't actually make decisions just because the environment they're in. They make decisions because of the material conditions that they face in their day-to-day lives and a whole range of other factors. And that's, I think, where the social sciences can come in order to provide this critique of nudging as a policy initiative.
Thank you, Rhys. Rob?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rhys, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. We haven't conferred beforehand, but I think what I'm going to say neatly segues with what Rhys says about opening up maybe that more critical agenda, because what I want to do is expand on what Rhys has said about why now, why has this behaviour change agenda emerged now, and specifically locate that in terms of some of the dynamics and some of the problems of our contemporary form of, I'm going to say it, capitalist economy and society. And then I'll conclude by saying something about the nature of the state within that configuration, and whether we should be thinking about the state as nanny, nudger or therapist, and whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. So in terms of contextualising the why now question, why has behaviour changed arisen at this moment? In addition to the important points that Rhys has made, I think there is an important argument to be made about the specific political and economic context within which this has arisen. And in particular, I think there is a strong case to be made that nudge-type interventions are really about patching up what we might call dysfunctions or pathologies of the contemporary society and economy, both at a kind of structural level, at a global level, and also at the level of individual subjectivity and identities. So that's the kind of defensive part of the project. But there's also a more aggressive part, which is about actually constructing new types of citizens for the further rolling out of particular forms of capitalist economic and social relations. So, to make that a bit more concrete, if we think about the level of structures, what I call structural problems, it's quite telling, I think, what some of the main areas, the ripest areas for strategic behaviour change interventions have been. They've been around the field of climate change, right, and how we recycle and orient ourselves towards problems of climate change. They've been oriented towards energy markets and how do we get consumers a better value by getting them to make more optimum choices in the energy markets. The same sort of argument's been applied to the banking sector and the way that people interface with financial services. Now, it's not rocket science that all of these things could be argued to be dysfunctional in terms of their relationship to the economy and society. We know about human-made climate change and its relationship to industrialism and entrenched corporate interests. We know a lot at the moment about the failures and indeed the outright corruption of energy markets, which are not something that people tend to imagine as acting as consumers within, but they're being constructed now as consumers within energy markets. And the less said about the banking sector, the better. So these are all the areas that just so happen to be seen as ripe for behaviour change type interventions. But the problem gets more specified and more individual than that. So we don't just think about the way that individuals interface with those institutions. There's also a whole range of quite clever technologies. For example, in the field of public health, Rhys mentioned problems of obesity and binge drinking and other behaviours. I think Kathryn's likely to say something about emotional well-being and the agenda of resilience, that we need to be more resilient to cope with what the World Health Organization have identified as mental health being the greatest health challenge over the next 20 years, and the sort of economic and social crisis that's likely to engender. But social theorists have been talking about these sorts of problems as pathologies of an unequal, a very disruptive sort of capitalist economy for 150 years, right? So in a sense, there's nothing new about diagnosing those problems, but the way that citizens are being positioned and targeted in the face of those problems is something slightly new, that we're going to become heroic choosers of energy products, or that we're going to become emotionally tough enough to handle the various disorienting and fragmenting effects that are very disrupted and ever-changing kind of economy and sets of family relations, etc., throw up for us. So that's what I mean by, in the bigger picture, this sense that behaviour change technologies could arguably be seen to be mopping up, patching up the pathologies of dysfunctional kind of social and economic system. And that agenda is bound up with in the contemporary moment, the other great enabler of behaviour change, which is a culture of deep-seated individualism. Of course, that individualism is partly an ideological effect of a particular sort of neoliberal political agenda, but it's also, well documented in the social sciences that our societies are becoming more individualised, and that's been a long-term development within modernity. And it seems to me that this throws up some quite tricky paradoxes, because on the one hand, in our individualist culture, we actually increasingly demand more choice. We value choice and autonomy above all else. We expect personalised public services. But then at the same time, when the state responds in that environment in what is an entirely rational way, which is to get down to the very individual level of targeting us, targeting our brains, our choice architecture, our decision making, the most profoundly individual level, we recoil from it. And we recoil from it because that very same individualist ethos has created a very strong libertarian and anti-statist set of social norms and political culture. Just think about Russell Brand mouthing off about, don't vote for politicians, anti-politics kind of rhetoric. So there's quite a complex and paradoxical picture going on. And that's reflected in the main critical responses to nudge, which tend to have a strongly libertarian character.
1 minute left.
Oh dear. I'm not a libertarian myself, but I think that the libertarian critique is very important in defending against overbearing state technologies. But my doubts about the libertarian technique is, why is it always addressed against the state? Why aren't the libertarian critics also pointing at corporations and private practices which have been trying to shape our preferences and our aspirations for, since the birth of consumer capitalism? So where do we go from here? I've moaned about capitalism, I've moaned about behavioural economics, I've moaned about libertarians. So I will say something about what the way forward might be, because I think actually in terms of nanny, nudger or therapist, there's something to commend each of those models, and which way we bend the stick will be a political decision, it won't be a technocratic one, right? So I personally, I don't think there's much wrong with a nanny state where the strongest hand of the state is appropriate to change corrupt corporate behaviour, or even to mandate individual behaviour where we think that is socially beneficial and it's transparent and something we can agree
Brilliant.
on.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Oh, didn't get a therapist or a
You can
we'll
come
back
back
to
to
that,
it.
yeah.
Come back to it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm a social psychologist working here in Sheffield. My interest is really how people go about making changes to their behaviour, how they regulate themselves, how they control their thoughts, their feelings and their actions. I don't know a great deal at all about politics, but it seems like the kind of work that I've been doing for the last 15 years now has been sort of shoved into the forefront because it's become part of the political agenda, and the government are looking to psychologists like me to say something about what they should do about changing people's behaviour. So, what would I say? What I want to do is to draw a distinction between two stages involved in making changes to people's behaviour. There's the motivational stage and there's the volitional stage. And I think these two stages are important to understand because they speak to this debate. So, what are they? Well, motivational processes are those that lead up to the person making a decision about how to act. So when you're deciding whether to do something, whether to change your diet, you weigh up the pros and cons of doing so. You take account of what those around you are doing and what they think you should do. And then you make a decision about what you want to do. However, being motivated only gets you so far. One of the first things I did as part of my PhD, and it was the work that was cited in the Mindspace report, is demonstrate that even if you make quite large changes to people's intentions, you change their minds, it has only relatively small effects on their behaviour. In other words, there's a gap between our intentions and actions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And we all know this. I only ever get phoned up by BBC Radio Sheffield at New Year. But the important thing is that there's a second volitional stage to making a change in your behaviour. The volitional stage is where you go about translating your intentions into action. So having decided to eat more healthily, you seek out opportunities to do so. You look for products in the supermarket. You think about how you're going to integrate them into your diet. So I always think about behaviour change in terms of these two stages. How is that relevant for the present debate? Well, my feeling is that it's more legitimate for the government to intervene at the volitional stage than it is at the motivational stage. Should the government try and change the way that we think? I'm not sure. Probably not.
Should they try to find ways to adapt the environment to make it easier for us to translate our good intentions into action? Perhaps so. So I'm not agreeing with the quote from Mindspace and saying that the government should be allowed to change behaviour without changing minds, which is the quote that's often associated with nudging. But rather that people be allowed to make their own decisions, make their own minds up, think about what they want to do, but the government finds ways to make it easier to enact certain decisions once the person decides to pursue them. So to put this in concrete terms, one of the classic examples of nudge is the fly in the urinal, which Amsterdam Schiphol Airport was apparently the first to put in place. So this fly etched into the urinal is supposedly there to help men to pee accurately. I would argue, I can't believe we're reducing this to accurate peeing, that accurate peeing is a volitional problem, not a motivational one. I don't think men intentionally avoid the urinal and pee on the floor. Rather, they have good intentions. They intend for their urine to be captured by the vesicle in front of them. But they need a little nudge in the right direction in order to help them to achieve this. So it's a volitional problem, not a motivational one, and that's where I think that nudging can really be employed to help us to achieve the things that we want to achieve.
Okay. On to Kathryn.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I wanted to extend our understanding and our debate here a little bit about the ways in which governments use psychology and other related types of scientific evidence to inform behaviour change. And one of the things I want to say at the very outset of my short contribution is that nudge is not the only show in town, and it hasn't been the only show in town before either. The terrain of behaviour change is very wide, and its current manifestations, the sorts of things we're talking about now, come from a whole swathe of initiatives that were started by the previous Labour government. And nudge, I think, happens to be perhaps just the most high-profile one that's being talked about. So I want to say something in order to widen that debate out beyond just thinking about nudge and its implications. And the first thing to say is that if we look across child welfare, family welfare, the whole history of assessing children with special needs in order to put them into special schools, and now how we assess them to go into mainstream schools, behavioural psychology and being applied in those areas in very direct ways is not new. It's been going on since the 1920s, and it's been a feature of education and different areas of social policy for a very long time. And if we look at the history of that, that can be in quite sort of subtle ways. It's not so much that governments say to these various services, you will use behavioural psychology. Sometimes it's a requirement, but more often than not, it's a far more subtle and diffuse process by which behavioural psychology gets into different areas of social policy. I think what's interesting about, as we've already heard from Rhys, Will and Tom, is that nudge is very high profile, partly because it's been so publicised, and partly because it combines neuroscience, psychology and behavioural economics in very interesting, compelling ways. But as I said, it's not the only thing that we should be thinking about. A few weeks ago, this salon had a very well-attended debate at the growing appeal of neuroscience, both as a way of supposedly explaining behaviour, but also how we might use neuroscience to change behaviour. And this government, building on the work of the previous government, has put ideas about child-parent bonding and attachment right at the heart of proposals for health visitors to do diagnostic preemptive assessments of mothers and babies to see whether bonding behaviour is going to be problematic, and to offer interventions if mothers and fathers are worried about attachment. So again, another just a quick example of where neuroscience has made its way directly into government proposals. There's growing interest in think tanks such as the Young Foundation and Demos in the idea that we might use epigenetics to measure the sorts of factors that will create dysfunctional families and find ways to take preventative actions. Now those are perhaps at the level of aspiration, but the interest is there, and it's just another example that goes beyond nudge. But the area that I want to just focus on briefly as well is what Will referred to as the rise of therapeutic interventions. And if we look again, particularly under the last government since 1998, in schools, colleges, employment preparation programmes for unemployed young people, family support programmes, welfare to work programmes for unemployed adults, and universities, we've seen a huge increase in a whole range of therapeutic interventions. And these are informed in very interesting but quite ad hoc and eclectic ways by little bits of cognitive behavioural therapy, little bits of positive psychology, whole techniques borrowed from self-help for things like Alcoholics Anonymous and group counselling. And the scale and number of therapeutic behaviour change interventions is very large indeed. And so just some examples, if we look in schools and universities, anti-bullying and anger management classes, supporting transitions into and out of school, into and out of university, workshops to build emotional literacy, to develop self-esteem and resilience. The applications of therapeutic behaviour change are very wide. An example in a completely different area of the borrowing of therapeutic ideas is the West Midlands Police, who've been trying out psychological interventions to work with Muslim young people that they see as vulnerable to radicalisation. So nudge isn't the only thing to discuss. And I think although it's easy to say some of these things are not new, it is also important for social scientists and historians to say what is new. And I want to just come on to some of the things that I think we ought to think about in terms of how they might be new. And that's the images of citizens. Images Rhys and Will have referred to in Nudge, images of citizens in the applications and the aspirations of neuroscience, and the images of citizens that we see in interventions based on therapeutic ideas. We've already heard the nudge, appeal of nudge is the Homer Simpson, and it's a common sense sort of thing. We can all say, yeah, we're all a bit like that. Neuroscience is interesting, of course, because it combines the idea that there's a lot we can do nothing about, because it's genetic, with the promise that we can intervene if we do it early enough. Therapeutic interventions are mixed. Some believe that we can behave more rationally as long as we are just sort of persuaded to understand our own history and our own sort of emotional legacies, and then make adjustments to that. And they all have something in common, that we're prey to subconscious emotions, that these are shaped very early on by different experiences, and that these experiences can cause lasting damage and difficulty. But for me, one of the most worrying images of citizen that underpins the therapeutic side of behaviour change, and I think we do need to be concerned about, is the idea that fundamentally, to a greater or lesser extent, we are all emotionally and psychologically vulnerable. And that's everywhere, from whole sets of policy documents going across all areas of policy. And the point about vulnerability is that it justifies the idea that we need therapeutic support, and that we can't manage even quite mundane things in life without that sort of therapeutic support.
Thank you, Kathryn, and finally, Will.
Thank you. I think shortly I'll be Will's libertarian kind of approach, but I will say that there is a place for nudge in certain situations. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, when I'm on a website booking my train tickets, and I on autopilot go London King's Cross to Sheffield, I would have liked that website to nudge me to say, "Are you sure you don't mean St Pancras?" Because as a result of that, I got to see somewhere called Retford today, which is the oddest train station I've ever been. Anyway, so yes, there's a place for nudge occasionally. So I mean, people have discussed nudge. So I won't go on about that too much in terms of what it is, but it seems to be kind of like a softly version of the ways in which government has been trying to influence our behaviour. The implication behind all of that, and it's actually, I mean, you could say it's been going on for 20 years or more from the Health of the Nation report that the Conservatives brought in 1992, I think, onwards. There's this idea that the government has policy goals, they are rational, we are in the irrational populace, and that we need to be bent to these goals in one way or another. And I think that raises a few questions. And the first is that we will be better off because of this choice manipulation, whether it's nudge or some other mechanism by which it's done. So that raises the question: well, who decides what better off means? Secondly, do these interventions actually make people better off? I think that's a reasonable question. And thirdly, what is the proper relationship between government and governed? So on the first point, you have to ask what better off means. It may seem straightforward to say, well, smoking is bad for you because you might die young, drinking is bad for you as well because of your health, but also might make you behave in an antisocial way, whether domestically, in domestic violence, or having a scrap on the street. We are clearly eating the wrong foods because we seem to be getting fatter. These are all bad for us, and so we should be persuaded one way or another not to do these things. That seems like a no-brainer from this point of view, and I think that's a very narrow view of what better off means. Here, longevity is presented as the aim of life, so it's clear that in the process of living, actually, we derive a lot of pleasure from our bad habits. The microbiologist René Dubos noted in the 1960s, in the words of a wise physician, it is part of the doctor's function to make it possible for his patients to go on doing the pleasant things that are bad for them, smoking too much, eating and drinking too much, without killing themselves any sooner than is necessary. And I think that broadly applies to government as well. That these are our choices, and we should be free to do them. And when we want the help, we'll ask for it. Every day we make choices about balancing the present with the future, balancing pleasure with denial, and so on. Yet after thousands of years of kind of philosophical debate about this, from sort of Plato and Aristotle onwards, somehow it's been decided that in fact experts and civil servants in Whitehall are in a position to answer these complex and subtle questions for us. That is why, going back to something that Rhys mentioned, Dana, really, we are predictably irrational. We lack self-control. We simply don't know what's good for us. And on the other hand, apparently, the monomaniac moralists in health campaigns, the bigwigs of various royal medical colleges and civil servants are all seeing. This reflects, I think, a very diminished view of human beings. I think it kind of reflects the kind of rise back to the surface of a particular outlook in society, which says there are two groups: there are the enlightened, and then there are the feckless masses. And I think the irony of I clearly disapprove of this idea that there are these two groups are so separated. The irony is that such evidence-based behaviour manipulation is often wrong. A proper appreciation of science would lead us to conclude that we should be tentative in drawing conclusions about what's good for us, and have a bit of humility when we do intervene. For example, we've been nagged for years to eat a low-fat diet, and particularly to avoid saturated fat. But increasingly, the evidence is that fat isn't harmful. And actually what happened was that fat was replaced by sugar in a lot of products, and as a result of that we got fatter. Certainly there is a decent school of thought on that. Drinking is bad for you, we're told, but moderate drinking, as there's plenty of evidence again that moderate drinking is actually good for you. So what's happened here really is the reversal of the proper relationship, what I think is the proper relationship between citizen and state. The state should be the servant of the people where required, otherwise it has no place in interfering in our lives if what we do is not harming others. And I suppose that's a classical liberal John Stuart Mill kind of approach, really. But what's been happening over the past few decades, but really accelerated under New Labour and now the Coalition, as others have said, is that the state is there to control and regulate and intimately regulate our lives. And actually, it pops up in unusual places. For example, school meals. You couldn't get anything cuddlier than school meals. Yet, once these were given as an emergency welfare provision for very hungry children. Then during the war they became a matter of convenience, so they could allow mothers to work in the factories to keep up the war effort, and then that kind of carried on in subsequent decades. But now, school meals are essentially designed to protect children from their stupid parents, who either don't feed them or feed them rubbish. The state essentially has to rescue children from the grip of the flatulent fat Philistines that brought them into the world. You read anything about school meals, underlying that all is essentially that the state has to step in and protect children and educate them about food because their parents are too stupid. So much for the sanctity of family life. What's interesting, I think, just to conclude, is actually that having been very, very fashionable, actually there seems to be a shift away from it. The EU's just banned flavoured cigarettes and selling fags in packets of 10. Mexico's just introduced a soda tax. There are plenty of people lobbying for one here. The Scottish Parliament has voted for minimum pricing of alcohol and plain packaging for cigarettes. So it looks like the political class, having toyed with this idea as a kind of sexy way of not being able to avoid the hard discussion about regulating our lives, has now kind of drawing back a little bit and losing a bit of faith in this kind of behavioural psychology. I mean, I don't really care how they do it. What I do care about is the underlying philosophy behind it, which is that we need to be controlled and our behaviour needs to be changed. Because I just don't think that's true, and I think it's going to make us less free in the long run.
Right.
I'd like to canvass the opinions of the panel on efforts by the government to reduce levels of smoking. Because you've got a curious mix. On one hand, you've got nudging with the introduction of plain packaging, as we see in Australia. But then you've got, on the other hand, the government legislating in law to introduce that. And on the other side, you've got a bizarre reaction to this from the kind of 1950s French kind of attitude of you must smoke to protect the national interest. In that you've got people saying, well, we smoke, but we pay lots of tax on that, and surely that keeps the state running as it should, and it's our duty as good British citizens to keep on smoking.
Okay, excellent. Gentleman with lime green jumper, if I could get you to stand up and also speak directly into the mic. That would
Stand up.
Yes, please, that'd be perfect, thank you.
I'm not as learned as yourselves, but I've thought about a range of these problems over time, and I've read quite a bit, and I think that the sooner you can influence people, the better. I get the feeling that my sense of self-responsibility was put into me at a very early age. And since it's supported by social sciences literature, I then asked the question, then, why isn't schooling tackled in a different way? Schooling, I see rather as putting children on a sort of conveyor belt, heading off toward a qualification. I'm thinking, well, in this rapidly developing world, the sooner that these people learn the initiative to seize commercial opportunity, the better. And why are we still teaching people in an academic way, heading them toward qualification, as opposed to teasing out the skills in an environment where the children themselves realize that if they don't do something about the situation, they're not going to go any further in the situation. I just happened to see a report on Al Jazeera just this evening about in Korea, about students that are just stressing out trying to get into university, and at the same time, I think there's a Korean robot industry is thriving of taking unqualified students in, and in their work environment and getting them to produce and all the rather technical skills needed to produce robots. So therefore, on the self-responsibility thing, I think that should be embedded in people in behaviourally as early on as possible.
Okay.
But the negative aspect that's never been is the risk aspect. In the nanny state, the sense of risk is growing, and the things that disarm us are the legal system and the safety system, which almost neutralise our ability to do things and warp our sense of risk, and I think that's another problem.
Thank you very much.
Mine's much quicker. I've just got a little one. As we've kind of seen, like a lot of, I think is it Will? Yeah, you mentioned about how how companies have a role in this, how big companies have a role in this, and a lot of big businesses are using this kind of research, and they're doing the nudging. Sometimes it's a bit more forceful than nudging, and so what I'm saying is should the government be does the government need to kind of compete with the companies, as in because if the government don't do these things, the companies aren't going to stop. They're going to influence our behaviour. They're going to try and get us to do things their way. So, in a way, is it if we're going to be influenced, is it not better to be influenced by the government? Who at least they are supposed to have our well-being and the betterment of the country in mind, whereas big companies have no responsibility to do that. And so is it what I'm mentioning is the government should the government be fighting fire with fire, really?
Brilliant, thank you. And to the chap at the back in the stripy blue shirt, I hope, yes he has. Excellent.
Thanks. I think I've just had my thunder pretty thoroughly stolen. I'm a doctor working in public health, and you can pretty much guess which side of the argument I'm going to come down on. But I guess what I'm concerned about, and what I'd like the panel to consider, as the gentleman in the Christmas jumper has said.
Sorry, it is Christmassy. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
The debate so far is presented one side of the argument, or is presented as if it's a one-sided argument, and purely state interventions that are pushing us towards one mode of behaviour. We completely ignored the opposite side of the argument, which is that we've had our behaviour fashioned for us for at least the last century by advertising and by corporations, and to continue to consider that that's not the case is to live without really having our eyes open. If we actually sat down and said, do people make decisions in a vacuum? Do they make are our social norms, etc., formed in a vacuum? Then yes, I would be perfectly happy to give up all the state's roles in promoting what we call good behaviour. However, that's not the case. And I often get quite upset with the liberalist agenda when it comes from a position of privilege and fails to recognise the influences that often put on people who have less choices and less agency to make their choices. The liberalist agenda sort of asks that we make choices because we're able to, and yet some people are not able to make those choices.
Excellent point. I will go out for another round of questions, but I'm just going to ask the panel to come in and then go back out again, okay, in the order that you spoke initially. So if I could start with Rhys. You can also respond to anything that anyone else on the panel has said.
But not taking up everything.
But not taking up everything, just the points that you want to draw out.
Well, I'll respond briefly to those final two questions, I suppose.
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt. Would it be okay for members of the panel to stand as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
We can. Oh, microphones.
Oh,
Let's try it. I think it'd be all right.
you can stand.
Yeah. I'll respond to the final two sets of points there, I suppose. I think I have sympathy to what you're saying in terms of the need for the state to fight back, if you like, and do something, and to help people make decisions, and to face up to the power of private corporations. I think there is an ethical question there about whether the state should be using the same tactics as have been used by private corporations in order to encourage people to make better kinds of decisions, if you like. So there's a little bit of an ethical issue there. There's also a little bit of a practical question, because whatever you might think about the amount of money available to the state to try and encourage us to make better decisions, it's nothing compared with the amount of money that's being spent by private corporations trying to get us to smoke, to eat more, and to drink more, and so on. So there's a practical issue there about whether the amount of money spent by the state is actually going to be effective enough spent on that, the whole idea of behaviour change when faced with that large amount of money being spent by private corporations. I think the other thing I'd say as well is that this whole idea about the you know, the private corporations out there trying to get us to do bad things, and the state here trying to get us to do better things, is a little bit more complicated than that as well. It's sort of noticeable that a lot of these private corporations are trying to get involved now in behaviour change. I know, you know, you can question these obviously in terms of their motives, but they are there trying at face value to get involved in this whole process of trying to get people to do things that have a public good or a personal good to them, if you like. And so there's one example, Volkswagen is sponsoring this whole fun theory, where they're trying to make things fun in order to get people to do things by making things fun. So there's an example of the litter bins in Sweden, where it's the bottomless bin. I'm not sure if you search for it online, there is this thing, the bottomless bin in Sweden, and basically when you throw things in this bin, you hear the sound. And so people are not just throwing their own litter in, they're picking up other people's litter in order to throw it into the bin. And that is sponsored by Volkswagen. But it's a sort of, it's obviously a small example at one level, but I think it complicates this idea of corporations, you know, just being about getting us to consume more, and then the state on the other side trying to fight back against that.
You don't think you're Volkswagen?
If I could leave that to you can come back to him after we've finished the round, is that all right? Otherwise we'll descend into chaos. Thank you.
Had the status of that. Well, thank you for those excellent questions and giving me the chance to pick up where I left off in my rant, because it enables me to finish what I was going to say about what I think the role of the state should be in this configuration, because I think you've made some really important points, in the sense that for me, while I think you can see a lot of suggestive and practical benefits from the state adopting and deploying nudge-type technologies, I think one of the risks of that is it waters down what many of us, I think, even though there's an anti-political sentiment generally, but still think the privileged role of the state should be, which is to act, perform its democratic function in terms of speaking on behalf of a greater social good. So I think that there's a problem with the state deploying tactics which have been used for a long time in the private sector to great effect, and then just becoming another nudger, because it waters down the functions of the state. Whereas I think the state is actually the only institution still that has the mandate and the clout, this is the nanny fashion, to push back against and regulate and ban where necessary, and oversee the activities of private interest and other sorts of corporate interest. So I think that the state can nudge, but I think there's a risk of it just becoming another nudger. That shouldn't water down its democratic functions. And I also think, with reference to what the gentleman said about schooling in early years, that the state, as well as being a nanny and a regulator in that respect, can also be, to pick up on the title again, a therapist or your friend, in terms of equipping us as individuals to navigate this very difficult terrain. Because we now inhabit a space online, in the real world, where we're constantly bombarded with these messages, with attempts to shape our preferences, to manipulate our psychology in incredibly sophisticated ways. One of the great things about the social sciences, that what can the social sciences offer, but also just good education in general, is giving people the critical skills and also the emotional literacy to actually stand back from and make judgments about these interventions. And I hope that would fulfil some of even the more libertarian agenda, where you'd be unhappy about the state doing this, but to help people to think for themselves in the face of this bombardment of behaviour change interventions they get from all sorts of sectors.
Thank you. Tom, is there anything you'd like to pick up on?
Yes, I can try. I feel like we haven't really answered the chap's question at the front, and I don't think I've got necessarily anything sensible to say on it, but I wonder if it might be, so the chap asked whether the panel could comment on what the government's done about reduce smoking. We know they've done various things. They've shown pictures of horrible lungs on packets, and then they've moved to banning smoking and so on. And I don't have a particular thing to say about the different things that they've done, but I think it's an interesting point where it's an interesting example of where you can position interventions on a ladder from doing nothing through to complete legislation. Do people know about the Nuffield ladder of interventions? So the Nuffield Foundation put forward this idea of there's a ladder of interventions. At the very bottom, there's no intervention at all. You just monitor the situation. I have to get my notes now because there's lots of rungs on this ladder. But the ladder goes up, and at the very top of the ladder, you completely eliminate choice altogether. You can't do this, so you're not allowed to murder people. Okay? And then there's 8 rungs in between them. And I think you can position smoking interventions at different levels. So I'm not proposing to go through these in detail because I wanted to make one other point. But one up from doing nothing is you provide information. The starting point of the Mindspace report is that providing information doesn't change good behaviour. Then you can enable choice, make it easier for you to make choices. You can guide choice through changing the default. That's what nudging does. Guide choice through incentives, guide choice through disincentives, or restrict choice. So you can see how different interventions can be positioned at different levels. The other small thing I wanted to say was just to pick up on something that Rob said actually. So I don't want to be the Scrooge here, the person who says that we shouldn't be taking pleasure from bad habits. And I agree, there are times when we do take great pleasure from things. We want a cake, we want the drink, and so on. You said, are people happy with their bad habits? And I think there's a lot of evidence which suggests that as a society as a whole, we are not happy with our bad habits. More money is spent on diet products than on high-fat foods. There's self-help books that are in the top 10 on Amazon purchase lists. So people are not happy with their current state, they're not happy with their habits, and they're trying to do what they can to change them. I think that's where government can help.
Thank you. Kathryn.
Okay, well I just want to perhaps come back on the question about what schools should be doing, and then I was agreeing with you quite well until you then said that schools should be doing emotional well-being and emotional literacy. So I just want to say it links to the gentleman's question there. I think the difficulty with schools, but not just schools, but also colleges and universities, is that they are being required to do more and more social roles. So the list of things that schools should be doing goes from employability, entrepreneurship, emotional well-being and mental health, environmental awareness, health awareness, dealing with your parents, etc. So I would be very cautious about saying that schools should be taking on even more responsibility about shaping people in the sorts of ways that you're saying. Or rather, if they are going to do that, then we have to say, what should they not be doing? So I think there's a real problem about schooling generally and education generally having become the receptacle for so many things that we decide other areas of society cannot do. And that includes a great range of behaviours that schools are supposed to address. I think the point I want to make about the idea that it's good to be developing emotional literacy in schools, it partly links in perhaps a bit of a gratuitous way to the question of agency. And I think that before we can say whether those sorts of interventions are good, we have to look at the research which shows what's happening with those interventions in schools and in other places. They're highly intrusive in many cases. They're very, very normative. They present a very particular view about what it means to be emotionally well, what it means to be resilient, emotionally literate, etc., etc. So they're highly normative. And the point about agency is that very often people can't choose whether they take part in them or not. And unlike most forms of therapy where you choose to go and have some sort of intervention, the sorts of interventions that we're seeing in the education system and in parenting done by health visitors are neither have any agency as far as I can see. So there's a real question about them being imposed, but there's also a question on what normative ideas about emotional well-being they're actually embodying. And the final point comes back to the point I made in my introduction, was that they're predicated on the idea that we need emotional support, and that has to be done by experts, and it can't be done by parents, friends, family, etc. So I think that there are some real problems if we go into the detail of those sorts of initiatives.
Brilliant, thank you. Rob?
On the smoking question, because I was thinking about that earlier on, I suppose my attitude would be I don't think the government should be doing very much to prevent smoking other than to tell me it's bad for me and that's it. But it made me think about the framing of the question. So hey, I've got my packet of cigarettes. And so one framing of the question about what I do now is, it says smoking kills. Okay, that's one way of putting it. Or another way of putting it might be smoking there's a fair chance that you'll be deprived of some of your 70s. So, you know, then if you're a 20-year-old thinking, 70s, well, you know, a bit older than whatever. You know, I might not be so, you know, I might be so that bothered about giving up that because I like smoking. Or another way of framing the discussion, as you highlighted, is you could have a little thank you here saying, thanks for giving us all of that money, which is helping to support health services for non-smokers, and also for agreeing to die early, therefore saving us all those pensions and expensive social care. Great, thanks for taking one for the team. That would be, again, a legitimate way of presenting the question. But we don't get that kind of framing. We get this like, you know, this is going to shorten your life and therefore you shouldn't do it. That's the assumption that that's what's better for you. I think this thing about the market versus the government's going to keep coming up. So I'll put in my 2 pennies worth. Is that I think most people feel like an antagonistic relationship to people selling them things. I think that they understand that when they see advertising, whatever, that somebody's trying to sell you something, and then you'll make your mind up about it, and so are a bit more kind of critical about these things. And I suppose a friend of mine's got this nice distinction between product placement and policy placement. So in product placement, like for example, this week I saw advertised, Jamie Oliver, Mr. We want proper home cooked food. He's doing his cooking program in association with Uncle Ben's. So you know that Uncle Ben's is there because they pay to be there, and it doesn't mean that Uncle Ben's is particularly good. It's actually just rice, folks. So that's great. Whereas in between the programs, for example, you might have an advertising for McDonald's during the commercial break, and then you come back to a discussion about obesity where the TV presenter's talking to the TV doctor about what you should be doing. Now that's a policy placement. That's basically the government line being promoted there about what you should do with your health. That has far more impact and costs nothing compared to the millions that have been spent on advertising, which has the bigger impact. I think that the policy placement has a much bigger impact on people's minds and on people's attitudes, and I think that that's the problem. I think that the difference is I expect a big corporation or something to be selling me something, and therefore I'm ready for that and I'm accept it. Whereas the government, for me, should be representing me, should be doing the things that I need. If I want help, I will ask for it kind of attitude. And and it shouldn't be trying to regulate my life. That's the wrong way around. We're the citizens, we elect the government, not the government deciding what we as citizens should do and how we should live. And I think that distinction is being lost very, very rapidly in the past few years.
Okay, brilliant. I don't think the Department of Health will be employing you in marketing anytime soon, but can I see a show of hands, please, about who? Oh, excellent. My jumpers weren't a success last time, so I'll try something else. And just so you're aware, I'll be going the other way round this time, so I'll be starting to enroll. Can I start with the lady in... it's going to be purple top. Yes. While you speak, can I just have a show of hands who else wants?
Can we be nudged effectively if we're aware we're being nudged, or does the success come from not rationally thinking through our decision and taking each choice? And then moving on from that, if we're not aware that we're being nudged, how can we scrutinise government, and how can they be still transparent if we're not aware of what they're trying to do?
Good point. Okay, gentleman in the... Yeah. You're just going to get pointed at.
I was just going to say, you've been talking about, say, banning like all this cigarette stuff and alcohol and fighting fire with fire, and surely preventing certain nudges should be as important as creating your own nudges. Like we don't have advertising for cigarettes anymore. That's just gone. Plain packets in Australia not to make it illegal, but just to make it so that, if you want to make an informed decision, that's your call, that's your responsibility. Because I think the role of the government in this should not be a nanny or a therapist, it should be as a facilitator for maximising personal freedom, not liberty, freedom. So you can't just kill someone, but you have a right to education. So surely the role of the government should be trying to prevent outside influences so that the entire role of the decision is maximised to you, and so everyone can make as many decisions as they possibly can.
We'll actually go this way.
I think I should declare a slight interest in that I am a civil servant working on national policy, although I'm here on a personal basis. I'm not all-seeing, and neither am I an academic, so I'm in theory, but it strikes me, listening to people talking, that it's easier to critique the role of government when we're thinking about stopping people do something that people might be harmful for us, than the other way round, where we might be thinking about things where it might improve, might be for the good, both the public good and individual good. They're okay at the moment, but we might want to do something that makes things better. At which point, the kind of interventions we think about start to start looking like each other. I'm quite interested in the panel's view about actually what you might be able to do and where those things might look nudge and not. And in particular, I'm interested in whether there's a real distinction between the motivational and the volitional. I know from my own experience it's actually very hard to do the positive and much easier to think about doing something.
Can you illustrate what you mean by that distinction?
Well, for instance, I mean, my area is in adult education, adult skills, and generally speaking, particularly, it's good to get more education, whatever level you are at. Systems tend to be quite normative. The processes in them mean that people on the margins are often get less good service and whatever. You need people, you can't learn without being motivated to do it. We've done an awful lot of things over the last 10, 20 years, tried an awful lot of things in the system, tried a few nudgy things, very difficult to make it work. You need some aspect of, whether we call it nudge or something, you need to motivate people to do something, to take action. And that's essentially positive. So I'm interested in what people think about where nudge fits into that kind of
interesting point. Thank you. The lady behind you. Oh, sorry, no, lady there. Sorry.
Hi, I've got 3 points basically. The first one is about informed consent. We know that people are disproportionately affected by wider determinants of health, and saying that people should just be able to make their own decisions. I really question whether that is informed consent, given that things like the British Army routinely recruit from areas of high economic and social deprivation, and they're the ones that go on the front line and get shot at. The other point was about Orwell, the idea that if you have £1, are you going to spend it on the gas? Are you going to spend it on the bus fare into town to get to work? Or are you going to spend it on a bag of chips because at least it's warm and tastes good? And I guess also this idea about ethical questions, and about how you choose good ends, which is essentially a consequentialist kind of version of ethics. And I wonder if anybody has thought more about deontic styles of ethics, that we have duty-based things that we should be doing, and also kind of virtue ethics, that there's something about human goods and about, you mentioned Aristotle and Plato. I was thinking particularly Aristotle and golden mean, sort of actually that we should be building people rather than just seeing them as players in overall ends and overall goods.
Interesting point. Lady, and then I will come back to the panel and then I will go out again.
Hi, it's a question really for you. It's a really personal question, but I hope you'll answer it. What age did you start smoking? The reason I'm asking that, of course, is because there's no choice if it's not an informed choice. And an informed choice, yes, you have a right to be able to choose. But I would guess that most people who start smoking quite early, whether they really formed the opportunity to make those choices. Secondly, I agree with what someone over here was saying about the fact that you need to have the practical ability to make the choice as well. So I was in a very poor area in Liverpool recently, near Goodison Park, the hospital there, wanted to get something to eat, walked along a street where there were 10 betting shops, 4 fish and chip, quick burgers, chicken. There was nowhere that sold fresh fruit. There was nowhere that sold anything that would be regarded as even reasonable. Not. And there was no choice for those people.
That's exactly the same as Saudi.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the panel and now we'll go out again.
It's linked to the...
Okay. If I start with Rob.
Okay, since my life history is...
Fess up now, fess up.
So basically, like everybody else, I experimented with fags when I was 13. After about a month, my cousin ratted me out to my mum, And she ingeniously said, "You're intelligent, you work it out," and then I didn't smoke again for about 20 years. All right, pretty, yeah, she knew how to play old psychology, my mother. But and actually, probably, I've been kind of bullshitty smoking, kind of like, just to show you government. But I'm not, to be honest, I'm not a big smoker, but that's the reality of it.
It's all the front.
So, in terms of environment, I think that these questions about environment are interesting because I think it says something about where this stuff is coming from. I think that during the post-war period, governments, the post-war consensus kind of said government can be the hand on the tiller of the economy, and we can control the economy, and we can stop unemployment from happening, and so on and so forth. And so they had a clear kind of raison d'etre. Their job was to regulate the economy. And that all went belly up, basically from the 70s onwards. But for a while they could kind of say, well, at least we're not, communists or something, and they could kind of justify their existence through what they weren't. But I think that since the 1990s onwards, I think governments have really struggled for a sense of why they exist, what their authority is about. And I think that one of the ways in which they've tried to deal with that situation to one extent or another is through intervening in more and more into our personal lives because of the relative failure, the actual lack of any great political distinction between any of the parties that we could reasonably choose from. They all accept, we're going to live in a free market economy basically with a lot of state intervention, but that there isn't any great black and white divide as there might have been in the past. So it's that sense of not being able to do anything about these bigger issues. So one of the things that Will mentioned was energy markets. Now, in the past, I think that the answer to the question about energy bills would be that the role of government is to ensure the supply of affordable energy. Whereas now it's about, well, have you thought about switching? Or maybe we need to regulate the energy companies rather than thinking, well, maybe we should build some more power stations. I mean, and sort that kind of thing out and look at cheaper ways of new technologies of providing, cheaper power. But all that kind of stuff is basically not really on the agenda. And so in terms of this discussion about energy bills going on at the moment, it's all about personal behaviour, either our personal behaviour or the kind of personal, the corporate proclivities of various companies. I do think that actually would be much more useful in terms of actually changing people's lives for the better if we did actually tackle these big questions of economics and why people are poor and that kind of thing. That would be a very, very useful thing to do, but because I think that they don't have any answers to those questions, they would much rather talk about our personal behaviour or corporate behaviour instead.
I want to just come back, but on a position of ignorance, and I'm hoping that one of you three could help me out here. It's about the question about when you know you're being nudged and the ethics of that. And I'm thinking of that case that was this year about the employment questionnaire, that employments were made to fill a questionnaire out online about their strengths and weaknesses. And it turned out to be a fake, and that the answers that came back were the same, no matter what your sort of results that came back were the same no matter what answer you gave to the questions. And the point was, as I remember it vaguely, it was to make people feel good about filling out a questionnaire about their unemployment looking for jobs, than to do anything about finding them jobs. Does that make any sense? And then there was a big hoo-ha in the paper about people then found out they were being nudged, but the whole thing was a fake. Does that make any sense? And maybe you can come back or not. Sorry, that was a completely non-answer, but there's an interesting case this year about nudge being exposed and turning out to be a fake. So that's a non-answer, sorry about that. I want to come back to the adult education question. I think I started my career with so-called non-traditional students, adults and young unemployed teenagers. And I think what's interesting when we look at adult students is two things. One is that the range of programmes that are now offered to adult students through things like the Workers' Education Association have narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So, you know, the days when you could go and do tailoring classes or underwater basket weaving or whatever have long gone. And I'm on a project at the moment for the Arts Humanities Research Council, which is looking at how Workers' Education Association programmes are now about mental health, primarily. So you might do creative writing or jewellery, but the real purpose is for mental health and well-being. And I find that very worrying, because I think that not only has the range of programmes shrunk hugely, but the target group has changed. And what's happened along with that is that the image of adult students in the mind of many educators is low self-esteem, low self-confidence, many barriers to learning that must be unearthed and looked at before they can learn. And I haven't got any evidence for this, but when you're saying to me it's not working, I'm wondering if that image of adult students is beginning to backfire. I mean, the Women on Access courses that I used to teach, working class women in Derbyshire, we never looked at them in that way. But they're the same students now, and yet the image of those students has fundamentally altered into this very psychological deficit model. And I don't know whether it is the case, but I wonder how many people that puts off as much as it draws in. But also the range of provision is massively reduced, and that's a problem, I think.
Brilliant, thank you.
I'm torn as to which of the two questions to answer, because your question would let me talk about my favourite experiment in social psychology, but then I can't give up the opportunity to tell someone, even in a personal capacity who works for civil service, what actually works. So I'm going to try to answer your...
You can tell me that after.
I need to explain. I'm going to answer your question, which is I don't think people can be nudged against their will. And I do have evidence, but you have to send me an email because I can't explain the experiment now. That's a cop-out, isn't it? It's a good excuse.
That's still so.
McRae and Johnston, 1998, published in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. It's amazing. What works? The point of nudging, the key conceptual point is that environmental cues trigger our behaviours. Right? So if you change those environmental cues, you can trigger people to behave in certain ways. And the problem that people are having with nudge is that the government are deciding what cues to change and the ways in which we should be behaving. But what I think the important message is that the way to bridge the gap between motivation and volition, the way to help them to translate their good intentions into action, is to teach them to use cues to their advantage. So we should stop waiting to be nudged by the markets, by the government, and start learning to nudge ourselves. That's the way we change our behaviour. So I've been studying this idea called implementation intentions, which is if-then plans that people make about how they're going to act. They identify an opportunity in which to act, and they identify a response to that opportunity. By making this sort of plan, they set themselves up their own nudge. They go, well, when I'm in this context, I'm going to behave like this. So I think the way to change people's behaviour is to find ways to teach them to adapt their own cues to nudge themselves, and then we don't have this problem about who's nudging us.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, the layers of complexity are sort of growing. I'd like, I mean, your question about transparency and efficacy, does it work? I think is absolutely crucial. I mean, certainly, my understanding, I think Rhys might know a bit more about some of the detailed areas of the studies on this, but my understanding of Sunstein and Taylor's work was that they insist on a transparency principle to nudging. I mean, my feeling is that if transparency and efficiency clash, so if it turns out that a nudge is not going to be effective if people know about it, I think too bad. I think the transparency principle should hold, right? And that's something that we can say in democracy that we think that's important. I mean, I think there are. It raises interesting questions about our disposition and attitude and how bothered we are, right? Because, for example, it's pretty well known that in supermarkets certain products are going to be put at roughly eye level, right, in order to draw us in. We know this, but we're not up in arms about it and rebelling about it. Whereas the example that Kathryn gave around people discovering that they've been nudged in terms of motivational techniques, they found intrusive and offensive. So I think it does depend on the specific context. But I think that sort of looking forward, it raises questions about what citizenship means. I was trying to write something about this, and I said, are we going to be nudged into a position of ironic kind of citizenship, right? Where we know, because look at us, the difference with nudging and like propaganda and previous forms of brainwashing is we're having a public debate here in the middle of Sheffield about nudge. It's not that secret, is it, right? So there's this kind of reflexive conversation going on about what nudging is at the very moment that various of us are going to be subject to it, right? So do we just sort of shrug our shoulders and sort of say, nah, we know we're being nudged, right? But the governors know that we know, but we're all going to kind of carry on regardless in this sort of ironic setup. Or are we going to find a situation where future political activists who are so enraged by the whole principle of nudging might start raising people's consciousness about nudge and sort of saying, do you realise that you're having your choices manipulated in this various way? So I think it opens up interesting questions about citizenship and also resistance. And just with regard to the other really good questions, it just seems to me that what you're doing is taking the debate onto the terrain of what we sometimes call think or deliberative approaches, where it's about empowering people to make better choices rather than seeing them as puppets, as you put it. And I think this ties into Kathryn's reservations about emotional literacy and resilience building in schools, because I'm much more relaxed about that. I don't have a problem with using schools as a site of experimentation where people can learn to find their own way about what emotional literacy is. So think about it in a critical way, what it means to be emotionally resilient, the sorts of choices they might want to make, what the end should be, what the good life should be. But my point, I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning, is it's always already political. In that moment, right? There's not a moment, there's not some space outside of nudging, outside of deliberation, which is entirely neutral and academic and objective, right? It's always going to be a political matter. So I think that the key thing is to build that into the deliberation, make people critical and reflexive of the fact that they're always engaged in a power game, in a political exercise, when they're being made more resilient or when they're thinking about what nudging is, etc.
Brilliant, thank you. Rhys.
I'll respond quite quickly, I suppose, to what you said in terms of openness and nudging. I think Wales has shown possibly quite a good example of what can be done there in relation to organ donation. Because it is a change in terms of nudging, because we've changed the default setting, but what acted as a prelude to that change, or will act as a prelude to that change, has been a long period of debate, public debate in Wales, in the newspapers, on television, public debate, political debate as well in the Welsh Assembly. All of that has sort of aired that whole issue ad nauseum at one level in Wales, if you're sort of listening to that debate going on. And I think, yes, people are very aware of the changes going on in Wales, but I think that doesn't undermine potentially the significance of that change in enabling more people to donate their organs. And I think it has been quite a healthy kind of approach to nudging. And I think that is maybe something more broadly that we can suggest, that there are, if you like, in some of the studies we've done, there are community approaches to nudging as well. It's not just the state, it's not private corporations that are doing this nudging. We studied one street in Oxford that were basically getting fed up with these boy racers using their road as a rat run. And so they redesigned their street, and they sort of painted these Victorian tiles on the road. They brought their sofas out some evenings onto the pavement with a standard lamp and everything like this to reinforce this idea that this wasn't just public space. It wasn't just a thoroughfare for people to drive along. It was an extension of the private space of the home, and something that was very important to the people living there. And so that was a nudge, but it was something that came from the bottom up, and maybe there's something there that we can actually think about. And I do feel as if, you know, your point about some people don't have that choice, I think that's something that we do need to think about in particular places. And we've sort of done some kind of studies maybe looking at betting shops in particular, and almost the fact that people are living in what we've rather grandly termed debtogenic environments. If you have obesogenic environments, you can also have debtogenic environments where basically you are almost compelled to gamble because it is the norm within that locality. People have written in New Zealand about the existence of smoking islands where, you know, you'd be happy there, but you know, it is the norm to smoke as well. I think in those kinds of situations, I don't think nudging is enough. I think you need something far more radical to deal with the kinds of problems that exist in those particular kinds of places.
Brilliant, thank you. Can I have a show of hands who would like to speak? Would you like?
Well, I guess it's a follow-up to that point, really, and it goes back to the idea of people making decisions for themselves.
but also taking into account the impact that one person's decision has on others. And I'm sorry to go back to a smoking example, but the one I would give is where somebody decides themselves to smoke in a car in an enclosed space. That's one decision. Do the same thing when they've got children or others in the car, but the children can't make that decision. I think it makes a quite different viewpoint there in terms of whether it has to be a nudge or whether there's legislation against that.
Okay. Gentleman right at the back with Mac.
Yeah, because you're saying something stupid. Like I want to talk about variability, like how it's within society and within a person himself. Like on the one hand, if the government has its way, we all don't smoke, we all don't drink, we don't watch Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, we don't read the Daily Mail, we all are a little bit the same and we don't do anything dangerous. And in the same way, for like as young people, I do think that it is very wise for a young person to drive too fast, to do something like that is a little bit silly, because you learn from your own mistakes. Society learns from variability, society learns from mistakes. If we all gonna be like incredibly boring persons that are just doing what we are supposed to do, I think that we lose a little bit the power to become further, because like to some extent, like it is in a lot of circumstances, people who went bankrupt will become very rich, and I think that is something to learn from.
Yeah, some great points about what you can do with nudging, but I'm going to nail my colours to the mast. I'm with the libertarian. I'm kind of fundamentally against it. Really, the way I see it is you have these kind of technologies of coercion on the one hand being used by the commercial organisations up against the same, or the improving technologies being used by the state, and it turns into this kind of nudging arms race as I see it. And the problem is when this escalates, where does it leave us? The nudging cannon fodder, basically. So that's really my view of it.
We could pass it over to the gentleman who's running the cameras. Thank you.
Yeah, I was reading the Nudge book on the way here, and one of the main argument for it is that it will nudge you to a better life. And I thought, well, that's good, I want a better life. And then so I looked at the examples of what it actually meant to have a better life, and it meant to actually preserve my existence. I could be healthier and I could be safer, so I could slow down in going around the S-Games. And just basically be less risky, and also eat less, eat more healthy food, and drink less alcohol. And then I sort of thought to myself, well, what does it actually mean to have a better life? What's missing from this picture? So I drew up a little checklist of what it meant to have a better life, and it basically fell into 3 categories. One, it is, yes, the preservation of my existence, but the other 2 categories were sort of having and enjoying things. Whether that's holidays, a nice wage, a house, a car, all the sort of things that people want out of life. And then the other category was creating, making, doing things, And so it seems that all the focus is on the first, the health and safety, the preservation of existence. And it's just on this point about the advertising, is that what actual the critique of advertising, everyone broadly accepts the nudge agenda, but there's a real critique of marketing and advertising, especially amongst the sort of left liberal academics. One particular I was speaking to this morning, who was just slagging off advertising to me. And it really struck me that what you're actually doing is you're stigmatising the one aspect of a better life, which actually a lot of people do aspire to, which is the having, the enjoying. And so, and that's the one type of nudging and influencing that I'd maybe, support really.
Brilliant. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken before who would like to speak before? Oh, there's lots of people. Right, I'll start with the gentleman with the microphone and then move to the lady at the end.
Okay, so my point is sort of similar to that, and I guess drawing on what Rob was saying about the sort of more historical view of how government used to act back in the day. People talk about propaganda and about government influence, and obviously governments in the 20th century used to influence people in a very coercive and direct manner. But what they were doing it for, whether in the Soviet Union, whether attempting to create a new communist society, or in Thatcher's Britain, where they're trying to make rugged individuals or whatever. There is a bigger idea there, whereas the current government and New Labour before just seem to want to control people and not really know why. And I think that's almost scarier in some ways, at least when people are open that they're dominating you, you can kind of fight back against it. So.
Brilliant. The lady at the end with the map, which is...
Mine's just a really quick one. Isn't there a danger of the people who aren't nudged in the right direction becoming stigmatised and alienated and blamed for not making the right decisions?
The lady next to you, and then I will come back to the panel and go out again.
I'm a PGCE teacher, so I'm training to be a maths teacher. And it seems like a big part of my profession to be is to become a really good nudger. So we're told that you need to have really fun activities that are almost gimmicky to engage students. We're told to sort of make homeworks easy online or more fun with pictures. We're told to ask questions like, what should you do, rather than please do this. And yet it seems like kids are becoming less and less engaged, becoming more resilient to nudging. So what are we getting wrong as teachers?
Okay, very quick question there.
I was just very interested in how you said we should motivate people to motivate themselves, like nudge people to nudge themselves. I was following the trend, like how people are doubting, like whether we are actually aware of the government nudging us. So my question is like, how are we supposed to nudge people to nudge themselves? Like under like, you know, like when people feel that the government, or like when we feel that there is a nudger out there, like when people are conscious of this debate going on. Thank you very much.
Good point. All right, I start with Rhys and then go in the audience.
Very quickly, that final question, I suppose, of how do you nudge yourself? There's a Danish nudging network, which is very prominent in the field, I Nudge You. And they have a blog there, and somebody has written quite recently about how you can actually nudge yourself to go out for that run after work. And you come back from work and you put your tracksuit on or whatever you run in, and even if you don't have, it almost sort of sells that idea to yourself that this is something that you are going to do, or you know that you should be drinking more water during the day in order to keep yourself hydrated when you're in the office. So put a jug on the table. You're aware of what you're doing, yes, at one level, but it's the fact that that thing is there is going to encourage you to drink. So there are ways in which you can self-nudge, I suppose, at one level. I think the other sort of response I'll make is hopefully sort of tying some of the issues together, and maybe introducing something slightly different, which is the idea of harm and nudging. And I think part of what explains maybe what is deemed to be legitimate in terms of the state's response is whether you're harming yourself or not. In terms of smoking, you're harming yourself, but you're within your rights to do that. And so, yes, we maybe have these different kinds. We have cumulative taxes at one level, and we also have some efforts to try and nudge people to encourage them to smoke less or to stop smoking. If it's harm to others, it goes back to your point about being in the car, then all right, the state feels that is a legitimate cause to be able to legislate on that basis, and so yes, you can't smoke in public places in the UK anymore. So there's something there, but I think there's something also that sort of comes back to your question about whether you can actually, it is part of this aspirational aspect of all of our lives, that we want nice clothes, we want holidays, we want a fast car and so on. But there is something a little bit more ambiguous almost, which is harm to the environment as well, and it's something that can, I think, obviously is important in the context of what you raised there, but then that raises something that is something quite difficult to try and encourage people to do, because it's sort of, you're not harming yourself, you're not harming others. It's something that is very distant from you at one level, this ambiguous, abstract concept of the environment. And I think that raises a whole range of different fundamental questions about how you can engage people to act differently in that respect. And it comes back to this idea that it is something that is distant from us, that is ambiguous, that is abstract, and isn't sort of something that, you know, we get that feedback on our own decisions and about how it affects us as an individual. It is slightly more difficult, but I think it's something we haven't discussed, but I think this issue of harm, I think, is something quite important as well, and how that feeds into the whole idea of nudging and what is deemed to be legitimate.
Okay, I think I've got a few remarks that address all 6 points that we made. Right, let's see. Right, because a theme that seemed to come across from the questions was what's the vision at the end of all this? What's the vision? As Kathryn put it earlier about the image of the citizen that's there. The gentleman at the back mentioned it was sort of saying, is there a sort of implicit perfectionism in this? What about our opportunity to make mistakes and to learn from mistakes? But I would say that actually. The weird thing about nudge is it's sort of predicated on a kind of almost original sin kind of idea, right? That we're just rubbish, right? All our modernist hopes and ambitions and trying to build the perfect human, all that type of policy making was fundamentally flawed, and we need to accept that we're rubbish, that we've sinned or whatever, that we're Homer Simpson, and then build policy around that. And in relation to the question about do we then get blamed for failing to make the right choices in a nudging context. I hadn't thought about this before, but no, not really, because we're rubbish, aren't we? You can't blame us because we're such dopes in the first place, because we're all like Homer Simpson. So in fact, the blame and the stigma should fall on the bad strategy and tactics and skills of the nudgers, right? That would be the problem. Then there was this question about the nature of a better life. And I believe that the point you were making was that you'd actually endorse advertising as a good type of nudging because it's tied up with aspiration and acquisitiveness. Okay, so I don't strictly agree with that, but I see where you're coming from. I think it's a fair point. But in terms of what's the bigger picture with nudge, what image of the citizen is it hooked up to? Well, I think we could say in our bleaker moments that it's actually about all that's left at the end of the ideological rainbow is consuming dopes, right? People who just want to do nothing, who are nothing more than pawns to be pushed around in the sort of strategies of advertisers and marketers. So in the absence of explicit grand ideological visions, all that's left is the complete commodification of our very identities and the desire to consume more at the end of it. And that finally takes me to the question of, which is what I think you were getting at, which is how do we make people nudge themselves or resist nudging, to get more proactive. And actually, one of the interesting things about the terrain, which is pointed to by nudge choice architects and nudgers, is it's all about symbols and group norms, appeals to people's aspirations. A lot of it online. All that stuff is actually really ripe for subversion and challenge and positive of alternatives. So, a great example is so-called culture jamming, right? Adbusters and stuff like that. Or, one of my favourites was somebody who subverted the Nike swoosh, and this email went viral because basically you could choose to have your own personalised Nike swoosh on a trainer, and with your name underneath it or any slogan. And this guy said, "I want sweatshop" written underneath it, right? And he got into this exchange of emails with Nike, and he said, "What better way to express my choice as a consumer, right, than to have you fully recognise your complicity in the sweatshop production of these materials, right?" So in a sense, he's subverting the very terrain which is used to nudge people, to push them to make sort of choices in the economic sphere. So I think that the technologies can be turned against themselves, would be what I'd say.
Interesting point.
I think it's slightly detached from the questions, but I think some questions have been quite directly addressed. We're talking about people as if they're sort of static organisms, that they have this one way of thinking. But I think what we need to appreciate is that we have up moments and down moments, don't we? We move through our days and our lives. So we have moments when we're quite virtuous, right? We have days, weeks maybe, where we're quite virtuous, where we stick rigidly to things. And then we have our down moments where things slip, things slide. We feel the need to return to our bad habits, to indulge ourselves in some ways. I think a key question in terms of changing people's behaviour is finding ways for people in their good moments to help themselves in their bad moments. So one of the key problems that's been talked about, a man called Lauren Nordgren, I think he's in the States now, talks about the empathy gap. People struggle to appreciate just how visceral the temptations will be in the critical moment. So even when you're in your good moment, you think, right, this week I'm doing my 2 sessions of exercise. I'm getting myself out for that half-hour run on a Tuesday night and on a Thursday night. We've struggled to appreciate just how wet it's going to be outside, how cold it's going to be, how tempting it is to sit on the sofa in that good moment. And so the question, I think, for changing people's behaviour is what can people do in that good moment to help themselves in the bad moment? And I think, in a way, that's kind of what the government's trying to do. It's trying to shape the environment to help us to enact the things that I think we want to do in those good moments, but perhaps we're too weak to do in the bad moments.
I just wanted to say something about advertising, and I was just thinking as you were talking about advertising that it was the Nike swoosh and the Just Do It campaign in the I can't remember what it was, the 1990s that made me into a runner. I had never run before, and I can remember being completely entranced by that advertising campaign. Perhaps a bad admission in this context, but I still remember it, and I still look at the Nike swoosh and think, very good. Anyway, there's a very experienced maths teacher in this room who I talk to a lot about maths teaching, and I have absolutely no idea about maths teaching, and I've never taught in a secondary school. But one of the things that struck me behind your question was the idea that the teacher's job now is about behaviour management. And the image of the pupil, I'm sorry to keep harping on about this image, this diminished image, but the image, even amongst very high ability students, let alone so-called low achieving students, is disengaged, easily bored, only motivated by assessment, only motivated by short, sharp bursts of teaching. I mean, if you go into many classrooms now, you see, especially in further education, which is my field, you see no more than about 1 minute at the most of teacher input, and the rest is a whole load of anything other than just they want to listen to you. And it struck me as you were talking that that's the real problem. It moves it more and more away from the joy of mathematics, not that I have any appreciation of the joy of mathematics, just my very good friend tells me it's a joyful and beautiful subject, but it moves us away from the joy of the subject and more to managing and nudging and cajoling these demotivated pupils, and I think that's really problematic because it seems to me it's a bottomless pit. And so I haven't got any good advice from experience, but it seems to me that the image is a real problem. And it's the diversion from the purpose of education, which is to teach people things, that's the real difficulty there.
Yeah, I thought that question about blame was quite interesting as well. I think it probably reflects the shifting sands of this discussion about behaviour change. Because I still think there's a lot of the blame culture going on there as well, and there's quite a lot of this idea of denormalisation of what I would deem to be bad behaviours. But then there's this, as Will was alluding to, the kind of you are weak and you must be protected. So this is a very big theme in terms of obesity now, and this idea of obesogenic environment. You have been placed in this environment and you can't help yourself. You're fat because you can't help yourself. How could you, an individual, cope with all these pressures? Because I think that's probably the one way in which they can now explain why the kind of health prescriptions about dieting and whatever failed, rather than because they're bad advice, but rather because, they're good advice, we're right all along, but actually it's kind of, multinationals forcing McDonald's down to you or something, so that's the way around it. So it sounds nicer, but actually underneath it, it's actually a more diminished view of people than the idea of you're a moral being and you should have chosen the right thing to do. So I think that's actually quite problematic. Another thing, just because you mentioned smoking in cars, is what I would call the invention of harm. So the classical liberal idea of Mill is, the harm principle. I can do this as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. So what's happened in recent years is that public health campaigners have invented harms. To kind of get around this, because the idea of smoking in cars is, a non-problem that's never existed before. The idea that people like trap their children in like smoke-filled like cages for hours at a time is just like a non-starter. I don't know anybody who would do that or acts like that. They'll always crack open the window and the smoke disappears. And there's an incredible amount of junk science around the smoking in car stuff, and this happens, and also in terms of smoking campaigns in general. They'll say, you might be standing by the back door and whatever, but you're going to die and you're going to leave your child behind, and that's why you're a terrible person. And so harm is kind of brought in to kind of neutralise this million principle of my freedom to make a decision for myself, and I think that's just it's really corrosive, it's really manipulative. And I think we should stand up for our rights to engage in bad habits if we choose to.
Thank you, Rob, for saying something incredibly controversial, just as I go to my last round of questions and try and tie up. Who would like to say anything? Any hands? Excellent. What I'd like to do is take another round and then go back to the panellists to the answers for their questions, but also to try and sum it and bring it all together. And I will get them to speak in the order going backwards, so from Rob back to Rhys, if that's all right with you. Can I have some hands? If I start with the public health doctor at the back, then the gentleman here, then Jack in the controversial Christmas jumper, and then anyone else who'd like.
Coming back to your point about harms and where do you draw them, I don't think we've invented harms. I think what you object to is recognising them. And that is your personal choice, but it's also something that you may be inflicting on others. To sort of rebut the point that Rhys made about the joy of Volkswagen sponsoring a bunch of bins that make lovely noises and make people throw things into them, that's a win-win. Litter gets picked up off the street, Volkswagen gets some free advertising or some sponsored advertising. It's a slightly different case when we're asking Tesco's to not sell us something that's going to make them money and make us fat. The real difficulty for me when I'm looking at nudge, and I'm forced to look at nudge as one of the potential tools in my toolbox, is where does nudge begin and end? And you could argue quite effectively that the smoking legislation is actually just a large nudge policy. And that banning smoking in public places, there's no way on earth that we could ever enforce that. There's no money for policing that. We couldn't run around and slap fines on everybody who smoked in a public place. The only way that's ever become possible is by shifting the social norm, by saying to people it's okay to tell people we don't want you smoking around us. And so it's been that shift that has allowed that legislation to be effective. Now, was that legislation because we haven't banned it outright really? There's no way we could really stop it, or was that a nudge?
Thank you. This gentleman directly in front of me.
Yes, so I'm perhaps making a rather narrow point, but similar to the definition of a nudge, because it was cited earlier that the change in the default setting in Wales for organ donation was classified as a nudge, but I'm questioning whether that's a nudge if my organs are taken from me after my death by default. Can I still be said to be donating?
Interesting point. Yeah. Gentlemen, yeah.
I'd just like to point out that I didn't buy this at the Christmas present. And I'll wear it all year round.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, kind of somewhat inspired by the question of transparency, and also of the kind of outrage that came when people realised they were being nudged, is like, what will, if the government starts to, to put a lot of these nudging things into practice, what's it going to do for the public's kind of trust of the government? Because, I mean, although we all agree that we shouldn't just, blindly follow our beloved government and whatever they do, but we should critique them, but we should also kind of trust them to, like, at the same time, like, as in, I feel like some problems in our society are caused by this antagonistic relationship between people and the government. You know, they're meant to be representing us, and then here we are, like, saying, oh, they're fighting us, we're fighting them. And so, like, yeah, kind of what do you, how do you think nudging is going to influence people's kind of like, yeah, trust in their government?
Okay. Are there any more final points before I go back to the panel? No? Excellent. I can start with Rob.
How to sum up? I think that...
Can you stand up?
Yeah, sorry. I think that there's a difference between the government doing these things, or that these being imposed from outside, and us using, maybe understanding these techniques a bit more to, you know, help ourselves. I mean, in terms of nudging yourself, I mean, I think that the most important thing, whenever you see like people doing serious behaviour change, is goals. You know, once they have a purpose that goes beyond just doing something in the abstract, that they tend to be more successful. So, for example, you know, I want to diet or something. You know, a woman wants to diet. You know, it's like, you know, when do I start? Why am I bothering this week? Whatever. I'm getting married. I have to lose X amount of weight in 3 months or 6 months. Then there's a clear purpose to it. It tends to be much more successful. Addicts giving up drugs, again, you know, they can kind of be in and out of the, you know, kind of rehab or, you know, addiction centres or whatever. Where when some life change means that it's worth their while, they find some sense of purpose to not taking drugs. That's when it kind of really makes some sense. I mean, I mean, I really don't have very much more to say about this, other than that I think that, you know, we have to seriously and critically examine the relationship between government and governed, you know, in relation to this kind of behaviour change. I think it is very insidious, and I think we should have a stronger sense of ourselves as, you know, questioning these things, and you know, demand the right to be free and not to have our lives micromanaged in this way.
I want to end by reiterating the point I made at the beginning, which is that the terrain of behaviour change goes way beyond nudge. Although it is, I mean, it's interesting that the focus is very much on nudge, but as I said in my introduction, it's much wider than that. And I want to pick up Will's point about the idea that if we took interventions for emotional well-being, maybe a good way to do it would be to have a very critical approach to the sorts of very normative ideas about emotional well-being that are being offered, and then to engage with those. And I would completely agree with that. But that's very difficult to do. Because there's the underlying assumption, and it picks up the point made by the cameraman over here, that well-being now is no longer what Aristotle and numerous philosophers and spiritual commentators and political activists have always seen as a rich, broad, cultural, social, political, material condition. Well-being now is reduced to mental or psychological well-being or mental health, and it's been narrowed so much that we've lost a sense of what well-being is, and that makes it difficult to engage with a richer idea of well-being when it's been so narrowed. And then the other thing that it also makes that difficult is, I've said a number of times, is the idea that we all need help to manage our emotional well-being. And that isn't just for serious crises, that's from everything from managing your friendships, managing your marriage, managing your work colleagues, managing your own anger or whatever it is. The idea is that we're vulnerable to that and we need help to do it. And that then makes it also very difficult to have a proper critical discussion with people in those interventions about what well-being is. And the final thing that occurred to me when Rob was being criticised for invented harms, the other assumption around emotional well-being, which is embedded in government policy, is that if you are emotionally dysfunctional as a parent or an individual, you harm others. You harm your children, you harm your relationships, you harm other people. So harm, I mean, whether there's certain harms are invented or not, but the notion of harm is being expanded as well. And that again makes a critical engagement very difficult. But critical engagement is still at the end, as we've seen here, a really important thing to try and do. Yeah, thank you, Tom.
Okay, I wanted to end by saying that I think society's crying out for help, to deal with its problems. I start the level 3 module that I teach, so it's the undergraduates, on self-regulation with a quote from Roy Baumeister, and he talks about the Western world being beset with all manner of social problems, and he talks about us being addicted to addiction. And one of the articles on the reading list talks about Britain having one of the worst records in Europe when it comes to rates of obesity, drug use, STDs and so on. I don't think we're actually especially happy about that state. I mean, I agree with the lady in black at the front. We're looking for an antidote to kebab shops. We're looking for someone to offer us the opportunity to make a healthy choice. And actually, we don't currently have that. So what I'd like to do is to, I'm going to go back again to the reading list, which we only gave you. It was on your seat, so there's no way any of you would have read any of the things there. But never mind about that. I've read them. Some of them are great. You should read them. But Kathryn talks about something I hadn't heard before, which is the progressive uses of nudge. And progressive uses of nudge, to steal bits straight out of your paper, is where individuals and communities are encouraged to agree what behaviours should change, and then to decide what interventions might work in the social, cultural context that shape collective and individual behaviours. So in other words, what the problem here is who's deciding how to nudge us. We don't have a problem with nudge. It's a fabulous behaviour change thing. The question is who's deciding it. I think if we started doing what David Cameron wants, the big society, if we decided to decide for ourselves how we wanted to be nudged, then we'd have a viable option. And I'm really pleased to hear about this Danish network, I Nudge You, which seems to be starting to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, sort of following on from that, I would say that we don't need to be afraid of the fact that there are all these attempts going on to shape our behaviour and our choice environments, because it's actually the justification in the original text on nudge puts this brilliantly. The justification they offer is that it's inevitable whenever you act in the world that you are going to present a set of options in some form. You put the stuff out in the cafeteria or on the supermarket shelf, right? Whether you mean to or not, that is going to influence, because of what we know about the way that people interact with choice environments, their preferences are going to be influenced, right? So therefore, you might as well consciously set those preferences in a way that you think hooks up to some kind of greater good. I'm not afraid of that, because what it does is it kind of politicizes all aspects of social life. What it does is it opens our eyes to the fact that through some kind of interplay between the interventions of choice architects, conscious or not, between our own psychology and experiences, between the microclimate of the environment, that our preferences are not just fixed and given or neutral, they're always subject to being interfered with. So that what we have to do then is bring that under some sort of democratic control. So I think this debate should be about how do we open up the spaces to bring the behaviour change agenda under democratic control. So don't be afraid of nudges, but do be afraid of attempts to just import science, a lot of this science into policy making and then impose it in a top-down technocratic way. Because we know that the history of just trying to read off policy from science is not terribly promising, right? So that should always be subject to critical scrutiny. And instead, we should interrogate the science, but also look to expand the democratic spaces and think about the ways that we might want to re-regulate to bring the activities of corporations back into the public domain and under democratic control. And also keep having that debate about what we should be doing in schools, what we should be doing in communities in terms of empowering individuals in order to make better choices within that always interfered with choice environment.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, just quickly then I suppose, I think we need to recognise the pervasiveness of nudging at one level. One civil servant that we interviewed a while ago said that this was the equivalent of laying down the drains, the public drains in the 19th century. That they were laying down a new kind of infrastructure for the state. And that's how they saw this idea of nudging. So it is, at one level, or pervasive. It's something that is being globalised as well. And I think there's some interesting things to say there about the way in which nudge is being nudged in different directions in different places as well. It's not being replicated in exactly the same way in different places, and I think that's something that's worth exploring. But I think one thing that we haven't really discussed at all is how effective is nudging as a way of changing behaviour. I think we've assumed in a lot of our discussion that it is actually effective, but I think the House of Lords inquiry into behaviour change posed the question and said, well, how effective is nudging? How effective are these various kinds of interventions in terms of behaviour change? We don't have the real evidence base there to show that these things actually work. We have, yes, experiments conducted by psychologists on their second years, trying to get them to do different things, but we don't have this broad body of evidence to see whether behaviour change interventions actually change populations' behaviour at that sort of scale. So there's something there that we need to think about, I think, at one level. And I think there's a lot of work being done as well in the environmental field, which actually questions this whole idea of nudging at one level, because it doesn't actually engage with this idea of changing people's values or beliefs. And it comes back to the idea about the idea of think as well. And that if you take the whole idea of nudge to its logical conclusion, once that choice architecture has disappeared, and once that nudge has disappeared, you're back to square one. Unless you change people's underlying values and beliefs. And I think I would see a role there for the state as the elected, the people that we elect to represent us, as an organisation that needs to lead in that debate in terms of changing values and beliefs, and not just changing behaviours in a superficial way.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to the panel as well, who I think have really been quite engaging. Really. Thank you.